Two boys walked into the Tower of London in the summer of 1483. They never walked out. No bodies were ever officially confirmed. No trial was ever held. No one was ever convicted. And for over 500 years, the most powerful royal family in the world has refused to allow modern science to examine the only physical evidence that might finally give us an answer. This isn't folklore. This isn't legend. This happened in the heart of London, in broad daylight, witnessed by the entire English court. And it remains the coldest, darkest, most unresolved case in the history of the British monarchy. So let's go back. All the way back to April 1483. King Edward IV was dead. He was 40 years old, seemingly healthy, and then gone. The exact cause of his death has never been fully agreed upon. Some said pneumonia. Some said a chill caught on a fishing trip. Others, then and now, suspected something far more deliberate. But that particular mystery would have to wait, because England had a far more immediate problem. The king was dead, and his heir was 12 years old. Edward V, named after his father, carrying the weight of a crown he'd barely had time to understand, was living at Ludlow Castle in Wales when the news reached him. He was a boy, educated by all accounts, serious and intelligent for his age, but a boy nonetheless. England in the 15th century was not a place that waited patiently for boys to grow up. The Wars of the Roses had spent decades teaching the English court one brutal lesson. Power does not sit still. Power moves. Power strikes first. And already the men around young Edward were calculating. The most important of those men was his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the dead king's younger brother, a proven military commander, a man who had spent his adult life in service to the Yorkist crown. Under the terms of Edward IV's will, Richard was named Lord Protector of England, guardian of the young king, the man responsible for delivering the boy safely to London, safely to his coronation, safely to his throne. That word, safely. It would not mean what anyone hoped it would mean. Richard intercepted his nephew on the road to London in late April. To anyone watching, it looked like an escort. The Lord Protector, fulfilling his duty, riding out to meet his king. But at Stony Stratford, Richard did something that snapped the tension of those first weeks into something sharper and colder. He arrested the men traveling with Edward, the boy's closest advisors, his mother's family, the Woodvilles, who had surrounded Edward IV's court for years, were seized, stripped of their authority, and within weeks, executed. Edward V rode into London not as a king arriving in triumph. He rode in as a boy, suddenly stripped of every adult he trusted, surrounded by men who answered to his uncle. The coronation was scheduled. The preparations were made. And then Richard moved Edward into the Tower of London. Now here is where the story is always misunderstood, and it matters that we get this right. The Tower of London in 1483 was not simply a prison. It was a royal palace. Kings stayed there before coronations as a matter of tradition. It had grand apartments, gardens, staff. Being moved to the Tower was not on its face a sentence. It was, officially, protocol. But protocol had a way of becoming something else entirely in that building, in that century. Edward's younger brother Richard, 9 years old, Duke of York, was still with their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, who had taken sanctuary in Westminster Abbey the moment she understood what was happening. For weeks she refused to give up her younger son, and then, under pressure, some say threats, some say reassurances, she chose to believe. Because she had no other choice, she handed the boy over. He was taken to join his brother in the Tower. For a short while after that, people reported seeing the two boys playing in the grounds, looking out from the windows of the royal apartments. And then nothing. No more sightings, no more reports. The two princes simply receded from view, quietly, completely, as if the Tower had swallowed them whole. On the 26th of June, 1483, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, declared both boys illegitimate, claiming their parents' marriage had been invalid all along, which conveniently dissolved any legal right either boy had to the throne. 3 weeks later, he was crowned King Richard III of England. The boys were not mentioned at his coronation. They were not mentioned much at all after that, and that silence, that deliberate, sustained, impenetrable silence, is where this story truly begins. Let's talk about Richard III. Because if you've heard this story before, and if you went to school in Britain, you almost certainly you've probably heard one version of it. The version written by his enemies. The version that gave us a hunchbacked villain, scheming and cold-blooded, murdering his way to the throne with the calculated patience of a man who had been planning it for years. That version was written by Thomas More, polished by Shakespeare, and burned into the English imagination so deeply that even now, 5 centuries later, it's the first image most people reach for. But here's the problem with that version. Thomas More was 5 years old when the princes disappeared. He wrote his account of Richard III roughly 30 years after the fact, drawing on sources he never fully named, under the patronage of a family, the Tudors, who had every possible reason to want Richard III remembered as a monster. Because if Richard was a monster, then Henry Tudor's victory over him at Bosworth in 1485 wasn't just a military conquest. It was a rescue, a restoration. The righteous king slaying the tyrant. That's a much more comfortable founding myth for a dynasty that had itself seized the throne by force. History in the 15th century was not written. It was constructed, and it was constructed by whoever won. So let's set aside Shakespeare for a moment. Let's look at what the actual evidence tells us, and perhaps more importantly, what it doesn't. There is no contemporary document that explicitly orders the deaths of the 2 princes. No signed warrant, no letter, no account from a guard or a servant who witnessed anything. For a court that documented virtually everything, land grants, financial transactions, legal proceedings, the absence of any direct evidence around the fate of 2 royal children is either a remarkable coincidence or a remarkably thorough cover-up. The first serious accusation against Richard came from outside England entirely. In December 1483, roughly 6 months after the boys vanished from public view, a French chancellor named Guillaume de Rochefort mentioned before the Estates General that the children of Edward IV had been murdered by their uncle. This was political language, spoken by a foreign official with his own reasons to paint England's new king as illegitimate. It was not testimony, it was not evidence. The confession that has done the most damage to Richard's reputation came from a man named James Tyrrell, a loyal servant of the king, later convicted of treason under Henry VII. In 1502, facing execution, Tyrrell allegedly confessed to smothering the 2 princes on Richard's orders, using a pair of hired killers. The confession was never produced in full. It was reported by the Tudor government. Tyrrell was dead before anyone could question him further. And the timing 19 years after the alleged murders, announced by the very regime that benefited most from the princes being dead, should, at the very minimum, give us pause. This is precisely the kind of evidence that would collapse in any modern courtroom. Which brings us to the suspects that history has largely let off quietly. Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, is the name that serious historians increasingly circle. He was Richard's closest ally in the months following Edward IV's death. He had direct access to the Tower. He had significant political ambitions of his own. Some researchers believe he may have had designs on the throne, himself not merely as a kingmaker. And crucially, it was in the late summer of 1483, while the boys were still theoretically alive, and in Richard's custody, that Buckingham abruptly switched sides, joining a rebellion against the king he had helped put on the throne. He was captured and executed in November 1483. Did Buckingham act on Richard's orders? Did he act alone? Did Richard even know what had happened until it was done? We don't know. We genuinely do not know. And then there is Henry Tudor himself. This is the version of the story that makes people deeply uncomfortable, precisely because it dismantles the tidy moral architecture of the whole narrative. Henry VII, the man who defeated Richard at Bosworth, the man who founded the Tudor dynasty, the man whose government produced the only detailed confession about the murders, also had an extraordinarily clear motive for wanting both boys dead. While Edward V and Richard of York were alive, Henry's claim to the English throne was, to put it bluntly, weak. His Lancastrian lineage was indirect and contested. The Yorkist princes, even locked in a tower, even declared illegitimate, represented a permanent rallying point for anyone who wanted to challenge him. As long as they breathed, his crown was not fully secure. Some historians argue that the boys may have still been alive when Richard was killed at Bosworth, that it was Henry, not Richard, who gave the final order. There is no proof of this either, but there is no proof against it. Now, the bones. In 1674, workers repairing a staircase inside the Tower of London made a discovery that stopped everything. Beneath the stone steps, roughly 10 feet down, they found a wooden box. Inside the box were the skeletal remains of 2 children. Charles II declared them the lost princes. They were reinterred with ceremony at Westminster Abbey, placed in a marble urn designed by Christopher Wren, where they remain to this day. In 1933, the urn was opened and the bones were examined. The scientists concluded the remains were consistent with children, aged roughly 10 and 12 close, enough to Edward and Richard's ages to feel significant. But the methods available in 1933 were limited. Gender could not be confirmed. Cause of death could not be determined. Even species could not be confirmed with certainty. For all the fragments, some of the bones showed signs of animal remains mixed in. Modern forensic science DNA analysis, carbon dating, isotopic testing could answer virtually every remaining question within weeks. The identity of the children, their biological relationship to each other, their approximate age at death, possibly even how they died. The royal family has repeatedly declined to grant permission for the examination to go ahead. No formal explanation has ever been given, and that refusal, quiet, consistent, spanning multiple decades and multiple monarchs, is the detail that lodges in your mind long after everything else fades. So what actually happened to them? After 540 years, 3 serious suspects, 1 unverified confession, and 2 sets of unexamined bones sitting in a marble urn in Westminster Abbey, what do we actually know? The honest answer is less than we should. But let's lay out what the evidence, such as it is, genuinely supports. Not the Shakespeare version, not the Tudor propaganda, not the romantic revisionism of those who want Richard III completely rehabilitated either. Just the 3 most credible reconstructions of what may have taken place in the Tower of London in the summer of 1483. The first scenario is the one most people default to, and it isn't without logic. Richard III had the clearest structural motive of anyone. He was Lord Protector. He controlled the tower. He had already demonstrated, with the execution of the Woodville allies, that he was willing to remove obstacles with speed and without sentiment. Declaring the boys illegitimate was a legal maneuver, but legal maneuvers can be undone. A sympathetic future parliament, a change in political weather, a foreign power deciding to back a Yorkist claimant. Dead boys cannot be reinstated. If Richard was thinking dynastically, which every political operator of that era was trained from birth to do, eliminating Edward and Richard was not cruelty for its own sake. It was insurance. The weakness of this scenario is the complete absence of any direct evidence. Not a single contemporary English source from Richard's own reign explicitly states that he killed them. The men closest to him left no accounts, no letters, no deathbed confessions that pointed clearly in his direction, at least none that survived if they ever existed. The second scenario centers on Buckingham, and the more carefully you examine the timeline, the more it refuses to be dismissed. Buckingham had access. He had proximity. And his behaviour in the months immediately following the prince's disappearance is, at minimum, difficult to explain cleanly. He helped Richard seize power, then turned against him almost immediately. If he had acted on Richard's orders, why rebel? If he had acted independently, perhaps hoping to destabilize Richard, perhaps hoping to position himself as a future claimant, then Richard's fury at his betrayal makes considerably more sense than the historical record usually suggests. There is also the uncomfortable possibility that Richard discovered what Buckingham had done and found himself in an impossible position. Publicly acknowledge that his nephews had been murdered under his watch by his closest ally inside his own fortress, or say nothing and allow history to draw its own conclusions. Silence in that context was not necessarily guilt. It may have been a calculation that the truth was more damaging than the mystery. We will probably never know. The third scenario is the one that the Tudor dynasty spent considerable energy ensuring nobody thought too hard about. Henry Tudor won the Battle of Bosworth on the 22nd of August, 1485. Richard III was killed in the fighting, his body stripped, displayed publicly, and eventually buried without ceremony. Henry VII was crowned 6 weeks later, and at that precise moment, if Edward V or Richard of York were still alive anywhere in England, they became the single greatest threat to everything Henry had just fought for. Henry's claim to the throne was, genealogically speaking, a stretch. His Lancastrian descent came through an illegitimate line. His most credible path to legitimacy was his marriage to Elizabeth of York, the elder sister of the two missing princes. But that marriage only secured his position if the princes themselves were permanently, irrevocably out of the picture. The Tyrrell Confession of 1502 was released by Henry's government at a moment of acute political pressure. A series of Yorkist pretenders had been, causing significant instability throughout his reign. Lambert Simnel in 1487, Perkin Warbeck in the 1490s, who claimed to be Richard of York himself, and who attracted serious support from foreign powers and English nobles before being captured and eventually executed in 1499. When Tyrrell confessed in 1502, it served one immediate purpose. It told the world that both princes were definitively dead, had been dead since Richard III's time, and that the Tudor reign was therefore the only legitimate order available. Convenient. Precisely, surgically convenient. In 2012, a car park in Leicester gave up something extraordinary: ground-penetrating radar, a hunch, and a small team of researchers located human remains beneath the tarmac. DNA testing confirmed them as Richard III. His skeleton showed scoliosis, a curvature of the spine, which lent a grain of biological truth to the Shakespearean caricature, though the degree of physical disability had clearly been exaggerated for dramatic effect. He was reinterred at Leicester Cathedral in 2015 with full ceremony, watched by millions. The scientific methods that identified Richard III beyond any reasonable doubt are the same methods that could be applied to the bones in Westminster Abbey within weeks. Mitochondrial DNA passed through the female line could be compared against living descendants of the prince's sister, Elizabeth of York. The question of whether those remains are genuinely Edward and Richard or two anonymous children who happen to be buried under a staircase could finally be settled. The answer has been within reach for decades, and the institution that holds the key continues, quietly and without explanation, to keep the door closed. Two boys walked into the Tower of London in the summer of 1483. One was 12, one was 9. They were sons of a king, brothers of a future queen, heirs to a dynasty that had fought for decades to hold England together. And then they were gone. The men who might have saved them didn't. The men who might have killed them were never brought to justice. The one piece of physical evidence that might resolve 5 centuries of argument sits 40 feet from Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey, sealed inside a marble urn, untouched and unexamined. History was written by the people who won, and the people who won had every reason in the world to make sure certain questions were never cleanly answered. So here is the question I'll leave with you. If the truth about those two boys exonerated everyone in power, if the bones in that urn told a story that was clean and settled and comfortable, does anyone seriously believe the door would still be locked? So who do you think was responsible? Richard III, the uncle who took the crown, Buckingham, the ally who turned, or Henry Tudor, the king who rewrote the entire story and handed it down to us as fact? Leave your answer below. I genuinely want to know where you land on this, because 500 years of historians haven't agreed, and I suspect this comment section won't either. If this kind of deep dive into history's most unsettling cold cases is what you're here for, make sure you're subscribed, because there are stories in the history of this island that are stranger, darker, and more unresolved than most people realize, and we're only getting started.